And if you ever watch a child that starts to walk, their whole goal is to find balance.
Yeah.
They start off initially learning how to turn over and roll over, and then they start off being able to, push up, crawl, and then they start falling. They start cruising on furniture, and it's just to be able to stand. And then once they're able to stand, they take that step. And once you take that step, you're off. And then once you're off, you don't remember how many times you've fallen. You don't remember how many times it hurt when you fell. You just know that you got into a place and that place feels so good that you're just going to keep going. And then you start walking the rest of your life without even thinking about it if you're fortunate to do so. And then in that way, again, you start to appreciate like that's just one way that you can find balance.
That was the voice of award-winning spoken word poet and arts advocate Cedric Hameed, and it is my true honor to have him on as the guest of this episode of the Page and Stage podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jason Cannon, and check it out, Cedric is also my first guest for season 2 of this podcast. Now, before diving into my conversation with Cedric, a brief Page and Stage plug. Now, this podcast is only one part of my story coaching work. Go check out pageandstage.art. That's pageandstage.art. There you'll find not just every previous episode of this podcast, but also the archive of my weekly newsletter, which is full of tips, tricks, inspiration, and encouragement for storytellers of all stripes. You can sign up for free and get the newsletter directly into your inbox each Friday, as well as every new podcast right into your inbox every other Monday. Everything is free, but if you find value in all this storytelling content, you can financially support me at pageandstage.art or forward any of the newsletters or podcasts to other story-loving friends, or hire me outright as your personal story coach. So if you're working on a memoir, play, or speech, I cannot wait to hear your story. Now, let me tell you a bit more about my awesome guest, Cedric Hameed. Cedric, first and foremost, is a family man, a humanitarian, a fierce arts advocate, and an award-winning poet who believes that local, national, and global change can be accomplished through self-expression. A native of Schenectady, New York, Cedric grew accustomed to using words as an escape from his harsh realities. As Cedric says, "Poetry saved my life, literally. I see the world in metaphors and similes, and when you can see in the abstract, you can create." Cedric began his poetic journey in 2003 when he ran a small poetry cafe as an outreach program in the South Bronx. And since then, he has won a fellowship with the Nantucket Project, led workshops at the Yale School of Business, and performed at the Kennedy Center and the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute of Democracy. He just published his first collection of poems, Balance, and I'm going to quote Deborah M. Jacobs, president and CEO of the Patterson Foundation, who says of Cedric and his work, "Cedric weaves words in ways that touch the soul and inspire us to feel possibilities." As you listen to him and hopefully read his poetry, I have no doubt you'll feel the same way. Here we go with my conversation with Cedric Hameed. I am on the Zoom with the one and only Cedric Hameed. And Cedric, you and I, we go back a while. I was thinking about this. I think it's been like 10 years? When was the first time you and I met over at Florida Studio Theater? You were doing spoken word workshops and classes and poetry jams with students over there. And we met through Beth Duda, who's now over at Patterson Foundation, right?
Yes.
And I remember so many times you just blowing the minds of my acting apprentices with the work you do. Do you remember when did you and I first connect?
It was around that time. It's just probably right when you moved down, because I think I heard about you. I heard about you prior to you coming down. Yeah, no, I had heard your reputation. Your reputation was far exceeding at that time, man, even before you knew it. But now they were talking about having this amazing talent coming down to work with the young actors and work with the apprentices. And they were talking about the need for trying to fill that for a while. Because when I first moved down in 2008, Beth did approach me, and we're doing a spoken word cafe there, but they also were looking for you at that same point in time before you knew it. So they were talking about your ability, and correct me, you had you came from the Midwest in that way? I want to say they
I
were talking a lot
from
about
St. Louis. Yeah,
yeah,
I came from St. Louis.
yeah, man, because you came in with a lot of energy and a lot of anticipation, and equally as much as you felt they were talking about me, man, they were really excited about the things that you were bringing to the theater also at that time. So
Well, that's
it was
really
a
nice to
great,
hear.
yeah. Mhm.
My 10 years there, I cherish them. It was one of the high points of my career for sure. So you said something too. You said 2008 you had just moved down. Where did you move down to Sarasota from?
So at that point in time, my wife and I had just recently got married, and we moved down from Wappingers Falls, New York, which is 60 miles outside of Manhattan. And I'll tell you how we got to that beautiful place, which was right on the Hudson. There's a 2 and a 5 train line in the Bronx, and it should take you like 15 to 20 minutes to get to Manhattan, but it never does. So it always takes you about an hour, hour 15, hour and a half, even on the express. So we decided that, you know what, rather than keep doing this in the city, let's go an hour and a half outside of New York City, and then I'll take the Metro North. And it pointed us to Wappingers Falls, which was awesome. But prior to that, man, I was doing a lot of work, just soul searching, trying to find myself through so many avenues of life. And in New York City was a very amazing learning ground for creativity. And when I moved down in 2008, it was really just to continue to keep soul searching, but I was really too scared to actually try to be an artist. So
Ah,
trying to hold the blanket of, the corporate parachute, but it was something that was quickly fading. So when I moved down in 2008, my brother-in-law had a business he was running, and he needed help with it. And he told me he was in Florida, and I just wanted to get out of the snow so bad. Um, it was so bitterly cold that year. It was a very bad storm, and that was the last one. The leg hairs on my leg were like breaking off from being so cold. And once I saw the bald spots on my shin, I said, I'm out of here.
Great. So you're a spoken word artist and a teacher, and we're going to get into all that. But I think the setup here is important because you just said something. You said two things that we're going to dig into. One, that you were trying to find yourself, and two, that you were too scared to be an artist. So I want to back up before we get to that spot. Where did you grow up? Because your journey to becoming a poet and spoken word teacher is I know pieces of it, but I think our listeners will understand the rest of our conversation better if they know where Cedric came from.
Oh, yeah. I pride myself on being extremely vulnerable and comedic at the same time because the honesty in it is amazing. So I grew up in Schenectady, Hamilton Hill to be specifically exact. And it was a beautiful place. A lot of a lot of thriving artistic energy. My dad is a jazz pianist. He had a lot of different artisans that would stop by the house. I mean, I learned from people every day. It was like Sesame Street. Um, but then at some point in time, like most of the Northeast in that way, when I want to say it was General Electric, when they pulled out thousands of jobs in a matter of like it seemed like weeks, but I'm pretty sure it was longer than that. But that plus the fact of crack cocaine coming into the United States created like an instant depression in our area. It was a vacuum of broken dreams at that point. So going from having this extreme light, and it's funny because Schenectady was also known as like Electric City. We went from this extreme light of potential to this vacuum of darkness. It was just sucking like the hopes of people left and right. And then I also grew up in the early 80s, 45. So I grew up in the early 80s. So about 85, I'm about 6 years old, 87, about eight. Around that time also, we had the largest raid in New York State. So
Mm,
350 people or more, like were literally just pulled off the street in broad daylight. So at that point in time, like not only was, our culture changing a lot in that area, but there's a lot of shifts, man. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of history that I think a lot of people from that area don't even realize how a lot of things started. So for me, I always felt like I had a sense of a lot of emotion and a lot of emotional struggle. And then playing basketball in Schenectady was survival mechanism for a lot of us. My old
yeah.
in the Basketball Hall of Fame for his career. My oldest brother would have been a one and done NBA All-Star perennial. All these different things like were triggered from exactly what you're saying was like, how do you start to become an artist? And before I even started to think about how I could become anything, the emotions of life were just way too real for me. I was definitely afraid of everything. I was afraid of my environment. I was afraid of people. I was afraid to talk. I was afraid to, do the wrong thing. I was afraid to like literally be in any space where I felt like I was shrinking and I felt like I was everywhere at one point in time. And then as I started to get more into like the avenues of athletics, not only did it, give me a chance to really focus on like building a practice, but it gave me a chance to have a break from the things I normally thought about. And then from that standpoint, that becomes a little bit of like a second nature walk. And I ate and drank and slept athletics. I was ready to bury my emotions in sports.
Oh,
Um,
interesting. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
seriously. And it ties into that because I say the nuance of being a person as well as pursuing I wouldn't call them labels, but I guess they're just really segments of who you are. Everything is allowing you to come into a fuller understanding of your perspective. And then when you hold on so tightly to them sometimes at different points in life, it seems like it's the threshold of everything. And for me, the threshold of everything was basketball. That was gonna be the way that I just continued just to, make it without, having to deal with the raw emotions of the fear or trauma or the reality of things that I didn't want to deal with. And I could fast forward past this part, but I couldn't. I wouldn't do a service. When I was in fourth grade, I was at a school called Dr. Martin Luther King Elementary School. There was a gentleman who had come from England, and he had a premise that if children were exposed to art at a young age, that they could literally rewrite their trauma, rewrite their future, and create a whole new pattern of behavior and belief. Right? This is
Wow.
so he came to our school and he planted a seed for me and like my classmates, but he chose like about 5 to 7 kids every Wednesday to shoot like a PBS documentary that he did on the effects of like poetry and children. So I never got a chance to see the documentary. I was sick and didn't get a chance to go see it. And this man was like paying it forward at a young age for myself and a lot of other kids. So that was also a seed that I was reluctant to let out, because again, I'm
Yeah.
safe expressing that there, but then I also tucked it away and put it deep, deep in the back of my mind until I met my wife. And I'll get to that point now because when I started playing basketball, we had a lot of success. I played with Lamar Odom. He was one of my
Wow.
teammates playing AAU as well as Elton Brand, another NBA player. Played with a slew of them. I played against Kobe when he first came from Italy, and a bunch of other players. And there's so many other stories that so many people that are with me could tell. But in that,
Did I gotta ask, did Kobe post you up? Did you get a one-on-one with him ever?
this is a most amazing story for those who really don't know the story about how it takes to develop in basketball. And I'm not going to say this specifically to, isolate him in that way. But, when I talk about the fear that you feel, the one thing that like really unifies me to be I feel like to connect with people is the fact that I had so much fear that I could recognize into someone else.
Oh,
And
yeah.
when you start playing in an arena, Kobe was Italian born. And in that, he also came to the United States at a young age and he was developing still. He was a good player, but he was not near what he was to become. And he was developing a lot. And if you listen to some of his interviews, he'll talk about the fear that he had when he first came in because he felt like everybody was stronger, faster, bigger than he was. So he was really more so again, planting the seeds of what practice can do. And then also, again, dealing with the fear, the
Yeah.
threshold of like of what that means to everyone. And then I'll even make it more relatable to everybody that was in that situation playing. Most and you have different backgrounds, different ways of coming to the same arena. But for the most part, once you get to that level of playing, everybody's playing for something that's way bigger than, just a satisfaction of I enjoyed playing. It seemed like everybody was playing for not just recognition, but like this is the only way I'm gonna make it. Like I have to
Yeah.
be here. And I think from an actor standpoint, you probably know the same thing with auditions. When you walk in and you see a room full of people and only so many people are gonna make this thing. And you could probably, relate with most of the people in that room, but you don't get a chance to really do it because you're all here for the same thing.
Yeah, it's almost like this the competition almost makes the stakes so high that the art gets compressed or the art gets pushed to the side. You stop thinking about the truth you have to tell and just like, I got to book the gig. And
Mhm.
it's very much a mindset thing. Can you be content as an artist even if I would tell my apprentices this all the time. If you
Right.
get booked on 2 or 3 out of 100 auditions, you're doing good.
Hmm.
So you can't go in with a competitive mindset. You have to go in with a mindset of integrity. And you've said this word a few times. So I'm going to come back. I'm sticking a pin in you meeting your wife,
Hmm.
but you've mentioned the idea of building a practice or evolving a practice. And I'm wondering if for you, Cedric, is discipline connected to practice? When you say practice, what does that mean to you? Unpack your version of the word practice for us.
So I'll take it through the full emotional experience that I had. So when I was younger, I grew up Muslim. My dad's father is a Pentecostal preacher, and we would go from like hearing Islamic teachings to going to like my family's church on Sundays every once in a while, just so we could hear different teachings. So the idea of discipline seemed to be not just like a theme, but it just seemed to be something that like was also divisive. So it just seemed to be like a divisive way of following something. But at the same point in time, I could see the essence of what they were talking about seemed to be about love. So then at that point in time, at a young age, I made my discipline to be something about trying to maintain something that was going to allow me to keep loving something higher or deeper than myself, or whatever the love was going to be. I was just going to feel it anywhere I could, because I saw that, like, the ideology of a discipline does not equal practice. You know what I mean? So like taking a step yourself and walking through things yourself. And it seemed as though like too, like when you're going through a lot of things, you could always, and I think a lot of life is the same way. My practice was really the fact of like what I told you that fear was doing was keeping me from moving, right? So my practice really was, how do I start taking steps for myself or towards myself, right? Because
Yeah.
like being immobilized in different ways, you might just run to something just to run to it, and that might be a bad decision as well. And then, you go through a lot of different things in life to realize that, when you start to take walks to who you are and who you want to be, and you can start to create a clarity in it, there's a feeling of like accomplishment and then this inner feeling of joy that becomes more the addiction, and it becomes more the remedy, and it becomes more the resolve. And then rather than it making it seem like it's a chore or something that like is like plaguing my mind, or I feel like I have to practice something, there's a feeling that improves by taking more interest in myself. There's a feeling of well-being that improves when I look at how much I can be as a person outside of how much I'm not as a person. And then there's a feeling of just like connectivity to other people when I feel as though I'm doing a really good job rather than I'm doing a really horrible job. And at that point in time, that practice is really that practice. I think the results of that practice, whether it leads to you, walking more, running more, spending more time with your family, writing a book, running, it's really just the result of how you feel. So getting to the practice of being conscious about how I feel has really been what allows me to continue to keep wanting to grow, because I would hate to just condense it to say that I've gotten to this finite practice that has made this work. The inspiration of other people always add to my practice.
Great. And so including other people would be your wife. So let's pivot back to that, because you were talking about how you'd buried this seed deep, 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 this seed of vulnerability, this seed of truth, of artistry, of being an artist. You'd buried it deep, focused just on athletics. But then it was, you specifically mentioned your wife as someone who helped you bring this new part out. So I'm guessing the practice that you established in basketball, in athletics, you've then, in terms of evolving, your wife helped you find a new piece of yourself. And even though it was a different expression, similar practice, but now as an artist. Talk a little bit about that moment meeting your wife and how she helped you unearth that seed or help that seed grow.
Yeah, that's the right question, Jason. That point in time,
Is she there? Is she listening?
uh, she would love to hear this to make sure I'm saying it right, because she wants to make sure I get in every goofy, vulnerable moment that's not smooth in the whole process of saying this. Yeah, so when I met my wife, so my basketball career at that point in time, I completely was like, I'm just going through the motions. I'm at a school just finishing up playing because I just want to finish up getting a degree, because literally going through the rigs of playing basketball was a lot, especially when you get derailed in certain ways. So I was really going through a depression that I couldn't even see. I'm pretty sure like my self-image was shattered. And when I met my wife at college, it was like she was this beacon of light. And, when you can say this all the time, and I'm going to speak from my perspective only. But from my perspective, I never once thought that like I thought I felt everything in life. I thought I felt every emotion, I was ready, early 20s. You're so silly to think that. But when I saw her, this it's like the fear came in was a different type of fear. It was a different type of fear. It's a fear of like, oh my gosh, I'm nervous. My hands are sweating. I couldn't really get it together. And at the same point in time, it's because she also could see something in me that I couldn't see in myself. And then at that point in time, like the feeling of love and the growth of love, especially when somebody can like see you in ways that you couldn't even see yourself to even try to love yourself. It's beyond an emotion of just the fact of how is this person inspiring you in the moment? It was more or less the fact of a deep soul wake up call to not only realize that, like, there's things that you could do and there's love that you can experience, but that there's love that you can continue to keep growing through and creating with your family, but also growing through all the different struggles in life. But then having someone who is growing at the same time with you, I think not only does it create the quintessential expression of what love has been and what people experience in it, but like literally, it puts you in a place to continue to keep loving yourself deeper. And, if I can continue to keep loving myself deeper, then I know that's coming from the avenue of energy that's coming from the people that show love to me. And that's been an immense process of healing in my life.
That's amazing. Listeners out there, I'm sure, and I can speak for myself as well. That moment when that lightning strikes and you crack open and you're like, uh-oh.
Yeah, try to write a poem in that moment.
Right, exactly. I don't know if words suffice at that point,
Yeah.
Cedric. You're going to dance it out.
No, listen, I'll embarrass you even more so. So, like, my moment was not only could I not talk, when I went to walk away from actually seeing her, I walked into a door that I was trying to open up, literally. So, yeah, I think I might have cracked it too. So,
That's amazing. Okay, so, and your wife's name, remind me, please. I am totally
her name is Jaina.
Jaina. That's right.
Mhm.
You meet her, she cracks you open, the seed starts to grow. Tie now into this. You said something so interesting to me, that you were too scared to be an artist,
Mhm.
right? So for you, was being an artist something that you thought was already inside you? Was it something that had been planted back in fourth grade, specifically through poetry? Was it something that you decided you wanted to aspire to be? When you say to be an artist, what kind of state of being is that? And how did you overcome the fear? And or do you still experience some of that fear?
So, yeah, that's a great question. So, the fear initially was when I was a child was the fact that somebody was going to squash my dreams.
Ah,
Like, you suck, you're terrible. This is, throw it in the trash, right? That was the fear initially. So you bury that and you let that go for years. And then you have that tugging that's like pulling at you, but you just ignore that too. But like when I met my wife, again, that feeling of fear since like I was walking in the doors and I couldn't like keep my balance. Literally, I started writing her poetry just so I could, explain the concept of what happened in that time of like, wow. So I was literally like feeling like I expressed myself in metaphors. I think in metaphors all the time, but I never trusted them. So when I would write her poetry, she would just give me a bunch of confidence. And then, that would translate to fear, but that's only like it's conditional though, because you're only comfortable with that person.
mm-hmm.
Transcendent moments of getting to it because my wife again has been like the motor and the catalyst. So you're asking about the rest of the vehicle, like on the car. That came from experiences of being not only just definitely terrified, it's just the notion that like, we all are not just one aspect or one moment of our life. There's still that aspect from every year you've been alive that has a memory or attachment of data. And for me, the fear, it was so deeply rooted that like I just had to get past the aspect of myself. And what it took is these two young men when I was in the South Bronx. My wife had convinced me to take on this poetry cafe that my brother was convincing me to do. And I didn't want to do it, man. I was running from it. I was scared to death. For almost a year, I'd like to ask me to do it. I said, no, I don't even know why my brother asked me. I didn't tell him I even did poetry, but I did it. And I did it for 2 years. And then these two young men in particular, they had gotten in so much trouble. And the people pretty much gave up on them. But they had come to me with a letter from Lehman College, and they had got accepted in Lehman College. They had dropped out. I didn't know they got their GEDs. And when I asked them why they did it, they said, well, we did poetry. We didn't know that we could do that. So we figured, what else can we do? And
Wow.
that simple phrase of these two young men, I even didn't have any hope from when I first met them because I had listened to so many people's perspectives. And at that point in time, I was going through so many different lessons of life and people and how I view the world based off how I view myself. And then going through that process of looking at these guys who were labeled in such a way, but then got their college degrees, they put such a fire in me about like, why can't I do that? Like, why can't I try? Like, why I had to see like if having conversations about, nonsense like poetry actually worked. So I went through the process of like initially, let me keep going until I see a no, or I see it doesn't work. Cause then I can go back into my constructed belief of like, see, I knew it wasn't gonna work. See, I knew, and at that point in time, having to be that honest, I think that because I didn't like now playing basketball would have been a different experience. Had I started out at a young age constantly saying I'm gonna be a poet, I'd probably been too embarrassed to say all this stuff. The fact that I didn't really have a label of poet, artist, vice versa, because I was too scared for either one of them, being honest about my vulnerability seemed like the right thing to do. And then from that standpoint, it seemed like more people were waiting for people to be honest about their vulnerabilities. So like
Mm.
they're looking at me in a certain sense and then talking about the immense amount of fear that I faced to get even liking the sound of my own voice. Most people just look at me like, no way. And I'm like, you didn't know that person. So it's like, again, when I told you other people add to that story, these two young men added to the story of why not try? Why not at least take a chance? Like we're technically at rock bottom, what people would tell us that we're at. So if that's the case, and we still did, so how long do you need to stay at rock bottom to try to stand up?
So Cedric, you run this spoken word poetry cafe up, you said in the Bronx, right? Up in New
Hmm.
York.
Hmm.
And then you move down here in '08 and you start up another spoken word cafe, correct? And this is just so the listeners understand. So
Hmm.
there's poetry that we study in high school, right? We study and it's always on the page. It's written down, right? But your specific, and you even said something interesting in the first segment about having to fall in love with the sound of your own voice.
Hmm.
And there's the voice of the writer, there's voice on the page, but there's also your literal voice when you get up in front of an audience and hold the mic and speak words that get
Hmm.
amplified, right? And you hear your own voice, literally, whatever it sounds like. Your particular journey as a poet, and we're going to talk about your first collection of poetry in the third segment, Balance, but you're a spoken word poet primarily, right? Poetry jams, doing workshops, this spoken word cafe. Talk a little bit about what a spoken word cafe looks like, how it operates, and what drew you to the spoken version of poetry so deeply as opposed to merely the written.
That's a good question because I literally this is so great because you're gonna hear the Forrest Gump in me more so than anything, right? Like
Love it.
all the time, I'm more Forrest Gump than Socrates, but people don't want to believe that. So I didn't know what I was doing when I first started doing poetry. I had no idea what I was doing. I wrote stuff to my wife that I thought sounded good, but then when it came to actually doing the cafe, the first time I did it, I invited like 100 people that I knew personally, and there was a massive snowstorm. 7 people showed up. I took it personally, though. I took it personally. I took it. I took it very personal. You could have skied and got there. There's no reason that you shouldn't went to Mount Vernon that night. So like we get there, and out of the 7 people that show up, I'm related to 5 of them to make it even worse. And I can't even say my wife at that time because we were dating. So we're technically I should have it's like I got home court advantage. I should have anyway. But I didn't want to do it. I was dejected, and at that point in time, I had not been to a spoken word cafe or anything. I didn't go to. I wasn't interested in it. I was again like I was so one track minded with emotions only come from this way for men and from this acceptable standpoint that I wouldn't even allow myself to even find a wider range to even express pain. So when I went through the pain of like in my mind failing with the lack of people there, I had a very valuable lesson, man. My dad came by and my dad had shared a poem and we had had like a very like tumultuous relationship up to that point. We have an amazing one now. But it was the first beginning seeds of like the love that was growing between me and my dad through this event. And it's a very intimate way of doing it. But I felt really dejected. I took me 3 months to write the poem for this for first event. I left it at home and then I'm trying to leave out the back door. My brother sees me, and if anybody's been in New York, everything is narrow. So my brother's 6'8", I'm 6'6", and we're in this really narrow hallway. Like we could barely see in straight. And he's like arguing with me to go back there. I can't even get past him to get out the back door. So after a while, my wife comes out and she's like, you should just do this. You can do it. And I'm like, I can't. I have a poem. So she convinces me to make one up. I don't know how she did it. And then before I go make one up, I throw up twice in the bathroom. And again, there's only like 5 or 6 people there. The spotlight is super bright. It's like blinding. I think there should have been like a warning on it. They should have never had it on.
It's like a movie scene,
It
Cedric.
was
This is
terrible. It was terrible. And the effects when the lights are too bright, you can't see anything, like even the
can't see
step
a
in front of you. So like
dang thing.
I'm like, this is good and bad at the same time. So now the only thing I can focus on is my heartbeat because it's like now my heart is in my throat because I can't hear anymore and I can't breathe anymore because like I'm like about to pass out because now I have to talk about feelings. So the biggest thing for me was like at that point in time was I just really wanted to dive in more so than anything than talk about how I felt. But somehow I just opened my mouth and then I just talked. I don't even know what I said. I just walked off and with 5 people, it sounds like a very sarcastic, sporadic clap. It can't be in unison. It's like, so it's not, you're like, this sounds very, very sarcastic. Then I have to remember where I'm at in New York, especially at that time, everybody, including my family, would have told me how bad I was. So like I literally was like, all right, let me just sit down. And my dad is the first person I see. And my dad's like, man, I didn't know you write poetry. And I thought he was gonna give me like a facetious comment. And he was like, man, that was really good. I actually wrote one. Do you mind if I share it? So it turned into this whole like night of sharing. It was awesome. But because of the effect, I thought it was a failure. So I literally had to go back to figuring out how to do this thing and what a poet was. So the first thing I did, I was working for the Yellow Pages at the time, and I started to go through and looking for different stores that did poetry. I found this place in New York that's called Poets and Writers, right? And I had no idea what the store was, no idea. I find a lady's name too. It's an ad. It says Bonnie Marcus on there, right? So I said, see her name on there. And I call up and ask for this lady, Bonnie. And when I call up, the people up front are like, do you know who Bonnie is? I'm like, no, I have no idea who she is. Is she expecting your call? No, she's not. Why are you calling? Hey, I'm trying to start a poetry cafe. I've never done it before. I'm trying to do it in the South Bronx. It's like an outreach program. I just need some poets. I just need her to help me out. They start laughing at me like ridiculous. Like, I have no idea who this woman is. And again, I'm like 20, 22, 23. And I'm getting like sort of embarrassed. I'm like, all right, I'll get off the phone. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to like waste your time. They're like, no, 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 no. This is great. We're going to send you through to Bonnie as a joke. As a joke. They're like, we're going to send you through to this lady. So I'm like, okay, she's going to probably scream at me and like whatever. So like, the lady goes on the phone. I'm like, and I start apologizing immediately. I'm sorry. I didn't know. They told me to pass you through. I need help. And the lady's like, you don't know who I am? I'm like, I have no idea who you are, ma'am. I'm sorry. She's like, and you need help for what? And then I explained to her that I'm trying to do this outreach program and I'm a poet just getting started. Man, she was so taken back by my honesty and my vulnerability that she was like, I can't believe that you didn't know who I was. You called me for help and you knew what to call and ask for. I am gonna help you. So at that point in time, I mean, there's like in the South Bronx, it's in a church building. Literally, it's not even developed. It's terrible in there, right? So we literally did the best we can, putting like spray painted murals on walls. She got like 7 of the best poets in New York City that were like performing on like Def Poetry Jam, traveling all across the world, books out. She put me in contact with them. People from New York, a guy by the name Keith Boogie Brown. He used to do nypoets.org. Was a publication. He put me in contact with this guy. They're giving me poets left and right. So at this point in time, they're coming down to the South Bronx. These guys are all like super established, super good. And I'm starting to do poetry workshops on a Saturday. And I still didn't know what spoken word was. I just was really in awe of these guys doing whatever. And at the same point in time, because I still had 9 to 5 and I was working in Manhattan, I didn't have enough time to write either and submit to being an artist. So I wouldn't, and then again, that's where I was still not committing to the fact that like I wanted to be one. I was sort of like moonlighting still, still
Yeah.
testing it out to see if this was going to go well. And specifically, this one artist, his name was Dennis Kurt. He went by the acronym of MAD, Many Attitudes of Dennis. He was from Queens. He was one of the best poets I've ever heard. And he came by and would come by these workshops. And he came by this one time I was hosting. And he picked up on the fact that I didn't write any poetry. And he picked up on the fact that like I was literally just looking around the room looking for things. And he stops me. And after I perform, he goes, man, did you just make up all those poems tonight? I said, yeah, sorry about that. Because I'm thinking I'm breaking. I'm breaking rules in poetry. I'm not trying to be specific in that way. And I'm just really just going off of my raw expression at that point, which was driven by fear. So he's like, there's not too many people that do stuff like that, man. Like, as a matter of fact, I don't think I even seen anybody do that. He's like, you have a really natural ability to do this. And I was like, to do what? He's like, to do poetry. Like, you should think about doing more of it. And I didn't really take him seriously. I just took it as a compliment. I kept it in my chest, and I was like, I'll just move forward because I'm not a poet. He thinks he knows what he's talking about, but he doesn't. So I just shrugged it off. So when it came to actually even accepting what like traditional poetry is versus spoken word poetry, I really just went off of what I really felt like I was inspired to say. Like, and then what I started to realize is that like my mind is always broken in metaphors. Like it's always been something that like has been a comparison to something in my mind. And it's like I can't help but to think metaphorically. It's been something that like is it's I've been like this since a child. So then as I started to get older, I started to do more workshops and I started writing. I was really reluctant in even just putting out my own work because I had more fun just actually just allowing the raw emotion out rather than having to write it down and have people reread what I just said. Because I think a lot of that too was accepting the fact of still from I think from a masculine standpoint, I'm releasing emotions and it feels unnatural.
Ah,
Some of these emotions that I'm releasing are so deep and vulnerable. I don't want to repeat this again. I don't know if I want to actually sit down and have somebody analyze the fact that I just said that.
wow.
And then from that standpoint, going through so many different workshops from like across the country, man, you start to see all these people that are brave of all different ages, from every background, from every creed, from there's not one ounce of humanity that hasn't been represented in the areas of conversations that I've had with poetry. And there hasn't been one person that I haven't seen that hasn't inspired me. There hasn't been one sound, one effort, even the person that writes in the back of the room and refuses to let anybody see their piece, but they leave it crumpled up and I read it and I see how deep it was. I know exactly what that feels like. And because of that, like I feel like I'm in a very fortunate position to see the growth of people and to see that like there's this veil that's right there. There's an expressive veil that like everybody adds to. And when you have a chance to face that fear and add to that tapestry, it's not only inspiring, but once you see how many people you can inspire, it just ignites you. And then
Yeah.
you see something that's there that's like it's not an exclusive feeling, it's not exclusive to any one person. You're just hoping that you can see more people start to get to that place within themselves so they can start to feel it. And then from that definition, I feel like anything that you do from a spoken standpoint becomes spoken word. I
Yeah.
think once you become like the master of your own emotional expression, I think whatever you orate and whatever you organize it in that way, because spoken word is like really a continuum of like a blank verse or free verse poetry. And then like literally the emotions that like people say is really that's unique to your own energetic pattern. You know what I mean? So like to say that like the definition of art really is just the expression in which you claim it. So and that's what I've learned from not just that, but again, like my dad being a jazz pianist, being around so many different singers, like I've watched all of them create poetry to make music, to make this, that, and the third. So I take even like movement to be poetic. So it's
Totally, totally. As I was listening to you, Cedric, I was thinking about, all the forms of poetry, sonnet, and then you mentioned blank verse, and like on a page sometimes, even the way the words are situated or, the way the words are spaced, the blank space can be part, just like you just mentioned, movement can be poetic. Well, the lineup of the words on the page can be poetic. You mentioned your dad again, jazz pianist, talk about, how jazz, so technical, so much form, but then within those constructs is the room to improvise for the feelings and emotions to just come out as they need to come out. And I'm just kind of riffing on what you're saying because it's so, I mean, I'm geeking out a little bit because it's all about, the words and the story. But for you, so two-part question here. Did you ever, or do you now record yourself when you're doing live improvised spoken word or poetry? And then do you work on those? Or is your writing of poetry, is that process very different from the process like when you flip into that improvisational mode on stage? How much do those two different ways of writing poetry intersect for you as an artist?
that's a great question because I think that I think you'll relate to this too in trying to find and answer that because the I think the avenue of artistry and being creative is to realize that you're a vessel at that point. And I think that once the person realizes that you come in tune with your intention, your energy, and whatever purpose that you came into that moment, if you allow yourself to surrender into yourself, man, what else is going to happen? You know what I mean? Especially when, and I say that with all due respect to the craft of what people practice, because you get to an intuitive practice once you've done something for a long time. Like you've done something. For instance, we all can identify with something, whether it's eating, walking, something that's vitally important us to be alive, that's become second nature. And I think expression not only is second nature, I think it's innately in all of us. But once you get to that point of being able just to master that expression, I think that it just puts you in this place where, so when I would speak, it was just more or less the fact of like feeling like I was breathing. It just felt like I was just exhaling. It was like, man, I'm just gonna exhale, and each word that feels good in this exhale is just gonna come out. And that takes a lot of like silencing the self-doubt in that way. And then it becomes a meditative practice because you're really just breathing through whatever is coming through and just being aware of your emotions in that space. So like if I'm making up a poem and like it's not really in those spaces, it's not really more so how I feel. I normally get inspiration from somebody to give me a word or give me a feeling, and then I can normally sense the room too. I can normally sense like, looking around and hear people's conversations, people seem like they're either more talkative or they're more introspective, or they're feeling something about that's happened, like people are talking about as far as, I don't know, anything in the world. And then from that standpoint, man, it's just like really just taking my collective wish for everyone in that room at that point. And then when I take it from that standpoint and say, man, what would I want for everyone? Like from the most expansive part of me, what could I give somebody in this moment is that's as much low as I can. That literally flows from creating poems in that way. Writing poetry. Now that's a you opened the rabbit hole on that one. So the last poem that I got in a book, in Balance, A Beautiful Place, that was the first poem that came to me. And I say that because I actually got that poem. I got that poem in a, hey man, that's my son, sorry. My son's waving to me off here. I got that poem through a dream. I was asleep. And you ever have a dream and you're like, man, this is the best song I've ever heard. Or this, man, I'm at my best right now. I wish
Yeah.
I need a computer right now, right? Where's the team at?
Yeah.
So I was sleeping, man, and I heard this, like I was this really, it's beautiful. It was a beautiful place. It's like that's why I named it. It was a beautiful place in the dream. And I could hear my voice saying this really amazing poem. It was sounded really, and I could hear these words going. I'm like, man, if I could only capture this. And what happened was I suddenly woke up, man. And when I suddenly woke up, I could still hear like the beginning parts of the piece, Be Still. And then I'm like, man, I don't want to say a word yet. Let me just grab my phone and just start typing. And then I just started and I could still hear that dream playing in my head. And once I started, and I kept doing, I wrote down at least, I don't know, half of that poem, like in like maybe 10 minutes after I woke up. And then I could hear the music too. I didn't have the music though. This is what's going to really be freaky about it, is that the music for A Beautiful Place came from a childhood friend of mine from Schenectady who lives in Dallas, right? So he lives in Dallas. He already had the song done. I had not heard it. And we just ended up connecting out of nowhere, right? I reached out to him. His name was Michael Edmondson. And I reached out to him and he said, what are you up to? I said, man, I just got this poem. I just did this. He's like, man, I got this song that I did. I just don't know what to do with it. So then he sends me the snippet and I start listening to it. And it didn't even hit me that this was the same song that I heard in my dream. The same exact song. It didn't hit me until I went to go record the song. And I went to go record it at Drummer Boy Studios with EJ Porter. And when I went to go record it, I knew something was up with the song too, because EJ, and hopefully he doesn't mind me saying this, EJ was like tearfully crying about like how powerful he felt the piece was. And he's not an emotional dude like that. So like as I'm sitting there, we're both like teary-eyed in there. And as we're both, I'm like, man, there's something's up here. And then it dawned on me, man, this is the same exact version of the song that I heard in my dream once it was fully put together and mastered. And it sort of blew my mind. So I really just took it as a another leap of faith that like, all right, let's put more of this intentionality in there. And from that standpoint, writing became not just, I didn't want it, and I didn't want to take anybody else's perspective on my own. I didn't want to jump into writing for somebody else. I didn't want to jump into, I really just wanted to take a place to really use myself as a reflective mirror. And then if the words could help somebody jump into a space of their reflective selves, then great. If they could just use my words as a way to reflect on themselves, then great. But I didn't want them to feel like it was only from a sense of place. I guess it's really been driven from again like this practice of like how do I continue to keep like expanding this love within myself, and then the writing just became how do I find more words that are not only like attracted to what I'm saying, but like it just felt like each. I don't know if describing it was like a journey. I can't even really describe it because the poems weren't written all at the same time. Some of them were written like years before. Some of them were written like in the past couple months. Some of them were written like way before. But like it's like the collection of poetry just seemed to all flow once I finally looked at it, and it just seemed to be again like something from my work of all these years. I just had this burning desire, I guess, internally that just had to speak and just at least, articulate like a practice that like became a mantra for me.
Cedric, you were just talking about how your first collection of poetry came together. This one came from a dream. This one I wrote years ago. This one I wrote a couple months ago. This is your first collection of published poetry, Balance. I will very happily say that it is Ibis Books, my little imprint, that I am the very happy, proud publisher of Balance. I'm so excited. I just saw too, you were tracking this as well. You're on some of those bestseller lists on the old Amazon, which is
Man,
super exciting. It's so
so,
cool.
so humbling, man.
And everyone, I'll put a link to the book in the show notes for sure, so you can go check it out. And I know even though it's only ebook and paperback now, we are talking about, as you just mentioned with the song, an audiobook version, so you can actually hear Cedric reading the poems himself, many of them backed with music. That is a project coming down the pike. But let's talk a little bit about how this book came together, Cedric. So as an improvisational spoken word artist primarily and a teacher, right? What finally was the itch you had to scratch in terms of collecting written versions of your poetry and putting that out on paper? What was the impetus for you finally putting that together and publishing your poetry as opposed to kind of speaking it into the ether and letting it be?
It's been my family most part. I know my dad had said this to me some years ago. You need to collect all of this to put to the book. I heard him say it, I did, and I have to acknowledge that I did hear him say that. But like my children and my wife, like more recently after the pandemic, it's one of those things like I thought like, yeah, I get around to it. I get around to doing something like that for sure. But I think pandemically speaking, it just warp speeded. It just put in motion a lot of things a lot quicker to look at how to be proactive in humanity. I just and rather than just trying to jump in and think that I could save it, really it just became a practice of like, what am I doing? Like as I present myself to humanity, like how am I doing? Like how's my energy when I see someone and when I present and when I have a conversation with them, and then on top of it, like how am I handling things? Like how am I actually getting past this well-being? My children and my wife and the rest of my family members, man, really we started getting into some really deep conversations about like life and about growing and about, death, about everything about that was going on. So, and at the same point in time, my children were showing such a concern for their classmates and for other people in the community that like it just pushed me to want to do something more so to try to not only like add more balance to them, but it's also again like it starts to help you understand like what are you doing currently to deal with like any type of stress or any type of anxiety. And then, there's a lot of things that are going on outside of my control. But even the things that I can't control, I can't really feel well being and feel happy if I feel like the people around me or the community I'm in is not feeling like at least the opportunity to have the same thing. And I say that because it just became like this process again of like when you start practicing well-being for yourself, the next evolutionary step is like, how do I help somebody else? How can I put my service into a way where it's being impactful? And from that standpoint, again, the catalyst of seeing my children, and then also, I think for all of us that are older, you always look back at life in hindsight moments. You think about like what you can do differently. And one of the things that I really wanted to do too is I'll share this moment with you too. One of the biggest growing moments that like I think that my dad and I had was I got a chance to see my paternal grandfather on his deathbed, and I had only met him twice. So I met him one time when I was about 5 years old. He gave me and my brother like $5, and the last time I met him, he was dying on his deathbed, and I didn't even know I didn't recognize him. I didn't know what he looked like. I had never really had a relationship with him to see him, even see what he looked like physically. But in that moment of having that short amount of time with somebody who is that influential in your life because they, the reason why you're here, there was a lot of trauma involved in that process too. And what I realized too is that like there's this moment that I had a chance to really just learn from his experience, learn from the fact that like, at the end of his life, this is definitely not how he wanted to be. This is definitely not how he wanted to try to let go of life. And then in that moment too, I can keep acting like I don't see this moment coming or I don't know this moment's going to happen. And before this moment happens, what is my face going to look like at the end of my life? Am I going to look like I'm still holding on? Am I going to look like I'm still regretting? Am I going to look like I should have said something? Am I going to look like I should have did something? Am I going to look like I'm still moving out of ways because like I'm being afraid of things, or am I going to do something because I love life, because I love being here? I love the energy that I have here. And I really just took that opportunity from my grandfather to say, there weren't many lessons I could have got from you besides this one. And this is probably the most important one. And that one is to take advantage of what you want to be yourself, then also what you want to put out there, but then also, heal the things that you can heal, do the things that you can do to like be proactively loving, and made a huge impact on me. It made a huge impact on like how I see putting this work out in this book, because prior to these experiences, I was very selfish with my pieces. So I had them written. I might have recorded a couple and put one out like from an audio standpoint, but because I was writing them and it was helping me so much, I kept it to myself a lot. And then what I started to realize is that like if I'm having conversations, I'm doing workshops and we're talking about poetry, I really need to get to a point of like, not only collecting all these poems and putting it out, but also getting to a point of, if it helps someone else, if it can help someone else, I would much rather do that. And then if it can help someone find themselves, then that's all the energy I need. And that's really what it became about. It became more so about the fact of, in that same moment of the fear we're talking about this whole conversation, I didn't want the fear to be like, I don't want to leave something, not just for my family, my children, but I want to leave something in humanity that's a testament to what I believe we can all be, which is balance.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, it's just, again, perfect pivot point there, Cedric. Why the title Balance? There's not a poem, right? It's not like there's a title poem inside called Balance, but you were very specific. You came to me with that idea locked. Why is the title of your first collection of poetry Balance?
It's a great question, man. So the, it's interesting because again, when I look at life and what life has been, you look at examples, you look at how life has changed, and everything outside of your perspective is teaching you something. And when you're so outside of what you want for yourself and what you see for yourself, you're going to be unbalanced in a lot of different ways. You're going to be imbalanced because you're either doing too much because people expect you to do it. You're going to be unbalanced because you don't want to do it anymore because people expect you to do it. You're going to be unbalanced because you need validation in order to do it. And then none of those things are equaling to the fact that you want to create because you love to create. And then, losing that aspect of life or not even living in it for a period of time, if ever, it's not only such a dark place, but it creates such a set of like negative tools that like you'll start to destroy yourself with, whether it's self-doubt, whether it's not trying, whether it's, not connecting with people, whether it's not connecting with yourself, connecting with your family. And those things become louder and louder the more that you spend time thinking about the lack that you have rather than the immense power that you can create. And I think that from the standpoint of like staying in that way, it's because when I was younger, I grew up playing basketball. I grew up doing all these other things, but like I never really felt like I was truly making the decision for myself. So, being pulled everywhere, I never really felt as though I had complete control of like what I wanted to emit in that way. So balance, I started to see even from a young age, having children. I have 4 kids and I had the chance to spend time with all of them, watching them walk, getting older. I homeschool the 2 youngest ones now. And if you ever watch a child that starts to walk, their whole goal is to find balance. They
Yeah.
start off initially learning how to turn over and roll over. And then they start off being able to, push up, crawl, and then they start falling. They start cruising on furniture. And it's just to be able to stand. And then once they're able to stand, they take that step. And once you take that step, you're off. And then once you're off, you don't remember how many times you've fallen. You don't remember how many times it hurt when you fell. You just know that you got into a place and that place feels so good that you're just going to keep going. And then you start walking the rest of your life without even thinking about it if you're fortunate to do so. And then in that way, again, you start to appreciate like that's just one way that you can find balance, you know? So it's a constant thing.
Yeah, I love that. And it reminds me of something that I would say I have this stick balancing exercise I use with actors and students a lot. And I wrote about it in my book too, but it comes down to the idea of balance is not a static state. Balance is something you have to keep recreating moment by moment. You can't achieve balance and be done because as soon as you stop, you will be you fall, right? As soon as you like if you imagine a stick on your finger, right? A dowel rod. You can
Mhm.
balance it, but it's balance is not still. Balance is not static. Balance is a constant movement, a constant reaction to the new forces playing upon you or on the stick or on your body. And so balance is about it. We think of it as stillness, but it only looks still. It's actually an incredibly active state of being.
You're so right. It's so active to be. It's yeah. So to be still, and it's why man, you're asking all the right questions, Jason, and you're saying all the right things because again, it would seem as though, and this is why I write so many times and I repeat so many themes in the book because you'll see it repeat so many times in life. One of the things I repeat is like it seems crazy, like when you're thinking and you're stuck in your head all the time, that being still actually is going to make a difference that like if you have all the problems in the world and you stopping for a second to actually breathe and let the thoughts go is going to actually help you out. That seems so ridiculous, and especially like and for me I suffer from PTSD a lot prior to like going to these different practices, so I've actually seen my brain and emotions not only evolve but heal through like being able to stop and process things. And when you stop and have a chance to process things, it doesn't mean that you're not going to feel things. It means that you're gonna be strong enough to feel those things and then still know who you are after you're done feeling that way. And that's a very strong and hard place to get to at the same point in time, because a lot of times being able to be still enough means that you have to let the trauma pass.
Yeah.
And as much as that seems like it won't be a thing and that it's gonna still it's just a sensation that replays all the time. And if you can sit still enough to let the trauma pass, there's another emotion that comes, and then you can start to settle your breath. But that's a very, again, like going through the process of having that conversation of balance. It's not an easy thing to do. It's something that you have to literally commit to yourself to do. And it's also one of the loneliest walks that you'll be on to find out that you have all this immense ability in yourself. It's the most scariest, amazing feeling at the same time. It's just, yeah, let go to be by yourself and know that you're enough in that moment.
Yeah. Oh man. We've done it before, Cedric. We have just talked and talked and talked. But I gotta wrap us up now. But everybody, yeah. Thank you so much, Cedric. I want to give you a chance now to do my favorite wrap here, which is two pieces of advice and a spotlight for you. So, advice number one is, what is the best advice that you have ever taken?
Don't make yourself sick enough to make a sick person well.
All right, say that again.
Don't make yourself sick enough to make a sick person well. You
Okay,
can't you
now
can't make
explain
yourself. So
that.
so literally you can't make yourself sick enough to make a sick person well. And
Mm.
I don't there's no label on the person. There's no person in particular that I'm thinking about because that person can actually be yourself. So what that means is that like there's a lot of times that like when you're like, I'll take it from my standpoint. From my perspective, there was a lot of times that like I was afraid, like I could feel that there's more that I wanted to do. There's more that I felt like I could do. But rather than just going inwardly to focus on the things that I wanted to do, it just like I would constantly keep trying to do stuff for other people. And then in a lot of times doing things for other people, you're never really going to meet their expectations. And it's not a judgmental thing, but living somebody else's dream is going to be your nightmare for the most part.
Yeah.
Constantly like putting and pouring out into someone is you're creating a different type of relationship, an enable relationship. And again, it's like whether it's intentional or not, there's no judgment there. So before you realize that, like again, you can even do anything, you have to realize that like if you're still sick yourself, or if you're sick yourself, you're not helping yourself or anyone else. And then if somebody else is sick in that way, right, whatever you define sick as being, if you make yourself unhealthy, how are you helping them? And then at that point in time, It really is the point of like modeling what you want to be. And then at that point in time, people will start to feel like they don't want to be sick anymore either. So that's really the notion of the quote.
Awesome. Very cool. All right, flip it around. What is the worst advice that you have ever given?
Don't listen to yourself. The worst
Oh
advice
boy,
ever
there's a
take.
story or two in there.
Not from a standpoint of the fact that like you need to listen to wise words. You need to have people that are coming from a place of a counsel. But from what I've experienced is that like when people come from a place of sincerity and they come from a place that's like really a loving place, when they speak to you, it's something that you already know anyway. It's not that you didn't know that. It's either you were afraid to make the decision on what they were saying, you already thought about what they said. What they said just either gave you enough motivation or gave you enough people that you knew went through it. But there's something that they said that you already knew. You just were afraid to make that decision.
Awesome. Oh man, Cedric. Like I said, we could just keep going, but at this point now, I just want to thank you for taking the time and just being so vulnerable, such an inspiration. And the last thing here is a spotlight for you. Obviously, I'm going to put your book, Balance, into the show notes, but if people want to learn more about you or get to one of your workshops or do you have a website, where can people follow you, find you, learn more about you?
That's a great question because at the point in time that we're at right now, I am looking to do certain things in the community, but I'm looking to do a different type of like campaign when it comes to the book and where it was workshops before, especially given where we're at locally. I really want to do things local here with organizations that would make more of an impact local for our community and having conversations there that can help further the energy that like, so many people or organizations are creating. I just want to continue to keep creating or even start creating a more proactive movement of love here. So whatever that looks like, I'm just open to it. So I'm really open to hearing the possibilities.
Awesome. I will say too that this will be a little bit down the road for everyone, but I'll put this in the show notes as well. I know on March 20th, we're doing an in-person event at the Senior Friendship Center here in Sarasota, where Cedric and his books will be available. So I'll make sure that's in the notes as well. And Cedric, if anything else comes up or other events, of course, obviously, I'll put them on the IBIS Books website. We'll get it pushed out. But congrats on the book. Thank you for trusting me with it. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jason. It was an awesome conversation, brother. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Page and Stage podcast. All my thanks to this week's guest and to all of you out there for listening. If you enjoyed or found value in this podcast, please tell at least one other person. Word of mouth has always been and will always be the best marketing tool in the world. You can learn more about all my guests and access their websites and projects in the show notes. And hey, feel free to send me your thoughts, your comments, your questions at jason@pageandstage.art. I always love to hear from you, and I might just even feature your questions on future episodes. This podcast is built with Alitu, the all-in-one podcasting app created by the amazing team over at thepodcasthost.com. Thank you again for listening. And until next time, I'm Jason Cannon, and I cannot wait to hear your story.